Wizard is a long-ranged 5 elixir splash card that has been in Clash Royale as long as the game has existed. Wizard is arguably one of the most iconic troops in the entire Clash universe because he was one of the few original troops in Clash of Clans. However, the Wizard is arguably a card that doesn't quite fit into Clash Royale nowadays. Its usage rate is above average in lower ladder but terrible in competitive play. Right now in Grand Challenges, it actually has the lowest win rate of every single card. On the surface, this may not seem too weird as there have certainly been cards in a worse state than the modern day Wizard, but what makes this case interesting is that the Wizard has been in this position for years, and despite long-term underwhelming use and win rates, it has received no buff or rework in almost 5 years. Even other long-term underused cards like Elixir Pump and Mirror were given attention recently in 2022. Now you might say a good reason for this lack of attention is because it's one of those cards that is really obnoxious to deal with in mid-ladder, meaning a buff or rework would potentially make it even worse for those at lower levels. However, Witch is in that exact same category, and that card has been changed and given tiny buffs multiple times within the last few years. And other cards that shared this similar position like Royal Giant and Prince were reworked and fine-tuned to a point where they're not really in that position of being nothing but a mid-ladder menace. Wizard is arguably the only card to never be competitively viable in Clash Royale's history at any point. So in this video, I will be discussing the history of the Wizard, my theory on why this card hasn't received any type of change since 2018, despite it desperately needing one, and what I believe Supercell needs to do to fix this card. So as I said before, this card was released all the way back in 2016 when the game was still in beta. Clash Royale's original cast of cards was mostly troops directly pulled from Clash of Clans, so I'm sure the idea of bringing Wizard to this game was a no-brainer. Now you have to understand that what was considered to be a good card with good stats was definitely a lot different during this time because of the smaller card pool and every single person being new to the game. I mean, just watch pro players from 2016. You would see that even the average Clash Royale player today could probably beat them. The average player's skill is certainly much higher today than it was 7 years ago. Now the reason I bring this up is because Wizard has one of the simplest mechanics in the game despite being 5 elixir, which is what makes him so appealing to newer players, which at the time was everyone. Comparing him to the Executioner, for instance, the Executioner at least takes some skill because you have to place him properly so that the axe lines up in a way that it can hit the maximum number of troops. Wizard, on the other hand, will always hit the troops surrounding the targeting troop in a very specific radius. Now, Executioner of course wasn't in the game in 2016, but this is to try to explain the simplicity when it comes to Wizard a little bit. Since placement wasn't as important as other cards, it made the Wizard easier to play, which made him very appealing. During this time period, he was actually considered to be one of the best cards in the game, having the highest usage rate of any troop. I would even go as far as to say that his peak was during this time period because it really is just all downhill from here. I will say some of the reasons Wizard was good was just because of the environment of the game. Nowadays we typically use spells to take care of swarms, but back in January of 2016 all of the spells were pretty bad. Zap and Lightning didn't stun, arrows were incredibly slow, and Fireball didn't even knock back certain medium-sized units. Now let's compare the stats of the January 2016 Wizard to the January 2023 Wizard to get a better idea of the evolution of this card. The Wizard back in 2016 dealt 5% more damage than the one today, however the DPS was still lower because the Wizard today has a hit speed of 1.4 seconds while the one in 2016 has a hit speed of 1.7 seconds. His sight range was 6 tiles in 2016 but is currently 5.5 tiles. This makes him slightly easier to distract in 2016. For some cards, a longer sight range is considered a disadvantage because it makes it easier to distract, but I would argue in the Wizard's case it's actually a buff because the Wizard benefits from long-ranged battles. If you're trying to counter Wizard, you're probably going to put high damage melee troops directly on it anyway, not 6 tiles away. But half a tile makes virtually no difference anyway. This change was really just to fix a bug. His splash radius was also 1.2 tiles at the time, but today it sits at 1.5 tiles. The last two stats that remain consistent between the January 2016 Wizard and the January 2023 Wizard are its range and its health. The range actually did go back and forth a bit, which means the Wizard's health is the only stat that remains unchanged throughout its entire history. Unless you count his movement speed, which I didn't really consider a stat, but with the Mighty Miner change recently, I guess you have to consider it. You might even be confused as to how the Wizard with a hit speed of 1.7 seconds was considered to be a top tier card, whereas the Wizard with a 1.4 second hit speed is the exact opposite because the faster hit speed should allow him to take care of swarms much faster now than it did then, which is supposedly the card's main purpose. Considering all factors, it's unlikely the January 2016 Wizard would perform well in the current Clash Royale climate. It's really hard to judge retrospectively what was truly good during this time period anyway because there were no challenge stats to compare with, 80 less cards, and the general skill of the player base was very low. I would even use Barbarians as an example to prove this. The Barbarians weren't changed for much of 2016 at all and were considered to be a very strong card for a while, although after a while with no nerfs, they slipped into being considered one of the worst cards. However, letting the meta settle out would not be what would happen for the Wizard. With the February 2016 balance changes on the way, many people wanted to see the Wizard changed. On February 2nd, 2016, Supercell would deliver on the player base's demands. The Wizard's damage would be decreased by 7%. This meant the Wizard dealt the least amount of damage it had ever dealt in its lifetime and had the lowest DPS it's ever had. 7% of course is not a huge difference though. It's always been able to one-shot low-health troops. Although we don't have official statistics to look at from this time, Supercell did state it was the most used troop among top players and that it was boxing out cards like Bomber and Musketeer. Today you really don't think of these cards as being in the same category, but back then Musketeer was a 5 elixir long-ranged card and Bomber was a 3 elixir splash card, and of course options were limited. Wizard was consistently boxing out the Musketeer, which is actually what led to the eventual deduction of the cost of the Musketeer. After this 7% nerf, the Wizard remained to be pretty strong. This damage nerf didn't really change any interaction, so it really didn't matter. Later that same month though, the Wizard would receive another change of a sight range decrease from 6 tiles to 5.5 tiles, which again, I say makes minimal difference. A few months later in May, the Wizard's range would be decreased from 5.5 tiles to 5 tiles, and apparently the 5.5 tile range was actually a bug originally, as only his effective range was intended to be 5.5 tiles, not his initial range. This was actually a problem with a lot of other cards in early 2016, and these last two changes with the Wizard were actually applied to several other cards as well. So these changes were more to fix technical issues than it was to get the Wizard in a balanced state. However, even with these rather seemingly small changes, the power of the Wizard was already seeing a decline. After the February 29th update, the Wizard would see a massive decline in its influence. We could certainly attribute part of the reason for the decline due to people being better equipped to deal with the Wizard, but the main reason was just rising better alternatives boxing out the Wizard. One card that certainly played a role in this was the Ice Wizard. This card was 2 less elixir, could slow down troops which made it better against larger troops, and had about 15% more health than the regular Wizard. At this period in time, the Ice Wizard had about the same amount of health as the Night Witch does today. Its major disadvantage was the damage it dealt. However, despite the damage disadvantage, the DPS is actually about the same today as it was back then, because back then it had a hit speed of 1.5 seconds, whereas today it's 1.7 seconds. The Musketeer also going down to 4 elixir contributed to the Wizard's downfall, as it was a cheaper alternative. With some growing competition, the Wizard needed some help. So in July of 2016, the Wizard would receive a small change, going from a hit speed of 1.7 seconds to 1.6 seconds, but this would just not be enough, as we'd come to see later. In September of 2016, Grand and Classic challenges would be added to Clash Royale. Finally, this would allow for an environment for cards to always be on an equal playing field, allowing for win rates to be an accurate representation on how powerful a card was. It was clear immediately that the Wizard was not performing well in this competitive environment, despite his popularity on ladder remaining high. This is mainly because a lot of people simply couldn't level up the Ice Wizard like they could level up the regular Wizard, because legendaries were excruciatingly difficult to upgrade in 2016. Despite this, the Wizard would continue to decline in use and win rate, forcing the team to change it again 3 months later in December of 2016. This buff made the hit speed 0.2 seconds faster, but made the first hit speed 0.2 seconds slower. This was well needed at the time because Lightning was rising in the meta and was extremely good against the Wizard. Overall, this was a pretty decent buff to the card, but it was just not enough to make the Wizard competitively viable, which would lead to it getting another buff in the next set of balance changes on January 23rd, 2017, making its range go from 5 tiles to 5.5 tiles. So yeah, Wizard had a pretty crazy year. His drop in popularity was just something so unexpected, considering he was the most used troop at the game's release, and the only real nerf he got was a damage nerf of 7%. But Supercell was clearly trying to make the Wizard viable in a competitive environment without making him too obnoxious by giving him small buffs intermittently throughout the year. Now that he had his original attack range back on top of the hit speed buffs, surely he would have some place in the meta, right? Well, even though we're only in 2017, we're already getting towards the end of the Wizard's journey in Clash Royale. This balance change that happened in January was actually the only one the Wizard got the entire year. As you may have guessed, the card was still in a poor state when it came to competitive play. But during this time period of late 2016 to 2017, It appeared that there was some contention within the community as to whether or not Wizard was a good card. Throughout most of 2016, he was always considered to be very strong or average at worst, but with competitive play, rising competitions, and players just getting better, Wizard seemed to be in a very interesting position. Some players were still having a lot of trouble dealing with this card and facing it very often, whereas some others thought this card was extremely weak. With Wizard being such a simple card to level up and easy to use, he was very appealing to a lot of ladder players, but once he was on an equal playing field with people who knew how to properly counter him, he was nothing special. Despite Wizard being statistically bad, the card was still complained about throughout 2017. Now, the Prince was in a similar position in 2016, but he was still buffed in a somewhat competitively viable state, and although they were doing the same to Wizard in 2016, that treatment would appear to stop come 2017. What didn't help the Wizard was that there was also a pretty notable event that marked the beginning of a sharp downward fall that happened in January of 2017. Clash Royale would release yet another 5 elixir long-range splash card, the Executioner. This card had a very similar function to Wizard, but the main difference in their mechanic was that the axe would hit everything in its path on the way to its target rather than simply hitting the target and the nearby troops. One of the biggest problems with Wizard was that it was just so fragile for 5 elixir. It was really just too easy to counter. Especially with lightning being so strong, Wizard just didn't have a chance. Executioner, on the other hand, had more health than a Wizard, being able to survive a lightning, and if positioned right, could hit a lot more troops at a time than the Wizard could. Executioner would end up being a better choice in pretty much any situation the Wizard would find himself in. Now, the Executioner was pretty strong when it first came out, but even after they got this card to be somewhat balanced and under control, it continued to outshine the Wizard, solidifying the drain of any competitive relevance the Wizard might have had left. The only real advantage it had was that it was a rare card instead of an epic card, making it significantly easier to upgrade. Remember, there was no Epic Sunday, lightning chests, trade tokens, or magic items, so leveling up epics was basically determined on which epics the game felt like giving you. Why would Supercell go from giving this card occasional buffs to not buffing it for an entire year despite his consistent poor place in the meta? The Wizard was buffed when the Ice Wizard was outshining it, but when the Executioner was outshining it, they looked the other way. It just didn't make a lot of sense, which was also in a similar position as the Wizard. 5 elixir, long-ranged, splash, fragile card that worked well in lower arenas and poorer in higher arenas and competitive play, and yet it still got 2 buffs after the Wizard in 2017. At least they were actually trying with her. Surely when 2018 rolled around, a full year since his last change, he would have to receive some sort of attention, right? Nearly a year and a half later, in June of 2018, the Wizard would receive the last change that it would ever receive to current day, at least when I'm making this video in January of 2023. All it would simply do is give the Wizard some of its damage back, and also making the Wizard's splash radius go from 1.2 tiles to 1.5 tiles. Finally, after more than a year, Supercell was giving Wizard some attention again. With Executioner outshining it for so long, this was well deserved. At least, Supercell thought. Even though 2% practically changes nothing and the radius buff wasn't even half a tile more, a lot of people in the community were actually upset over this. Just imagine if you were a low-leveled ladder player and you were constantly facing Wizard and getting destroyed by it, and then you read the balance changes to see it got buffed. This would confuse and frustrate you for good reason. This negative response from the community was likely a clear message to Supercell that letting this card remain bad in competitive play was a price worth paying to keep mid-ladder players from getting too upset. If this card was going to work, it was clear that it would just need a total makeover. But of course, Supercell chose to never do that because it was the last change it has ever received. The Wizard from June of 2018 is the exact same Wizard we have in January of 2023. It's been 4.5 years since this card has received any sort of change. This 2018 buff really didn't make a difference in the card's strength, so it remains to be in the same position it was before the change. When this buff was first applied, many players thought the Wizard was overpowered, but a lot of this would soon to be looked back upon as overhyped because its status quickly fell. And of course, the Clash Royale climate has gotten a lot more harsh and competitive over the years. The Wizard remains to be popular on ladder, bad in competitive play, and to this day has the lowest win rate in grand challenges. Even other long-term underused cards deemed unhealthy for the game like Elixir Pump and Mirror were given buffs in 2022 in attempts to make them viable. Witch and Executioner also received several changes in this time period, so why not even attempt to change the Wizard when you were willing to change all of these other unhealthy cards at some point? Why does Wizard seem to be this sort of special exception? Let's talk about 2019 now, and the reason why the Wizard got no form of attention this entire year. At this period in time, it was apparent every 5 Elixir Splash card was in a similar position as the Wizard. So this year, Supercell was finally going to crack down and fix all 4 of these cards. At least, they thought. Supercell started rolling out reworks for these cards in September of 2019, first applying the Executioner rework following a major Witch rework the very next month. But what ended up happening is that both of these cards ended up becoming extremely overpowered, and the rework was putting them in a more unhealthy spot in the game than how they were originally. On top of that, changing a card's core function so much frustrated players even if they were underused already, because it no longer served its original function that it did in their niche decks. Because of this, these reworks were reverted, and Supercell announced that the other planned reworks, including Wizards, were halted. So was that the end? Would Supercell now let all 4 of these cards stay practically dead in competitive play? Well, the original Bowler rework was having the Bowler deal extra damage to buildings at the cost of 6 Elixir, but it ended up getting a different rework than the one planned for 2019. In August of 2020, this card was changed and ended up being a success. Today, you'll often find it the most in graveyard decks, and it is certainly in a much more healthy place than before 2020. The Witch would also get a first hit attack buff and a faster initial skeleton spawn speed in 2020. The Executioner didn't get any attention until 2021, but eventually got a buff nonetheless. So how come all 3 of these cards in this category got some form of attention, but not the Wizard? Well, apparently there was another rework planned for the Wizard in 2020. In March of 2020, Clash Royale community manager Drew made a Reddit post saying that a rework for Wizard was in the works, planned to come out for May of that same year. This was a pretty major rework, as they were hinting that the Wizard would be reduced to 4 Elixir. However, Seth commented on this rework saying that the team really wasn't passionate about getting Wizard into a decent position, and rather the rework was actually being motivated by productive community discussion. So as May came along, there would be no Wizard rework once again. Moving into 2021, Executioner and Witch both got buffs, but alas, another year would pass with no Wizard change. In 2022, Supercell would finally acknowledge the state of the Wizard once again in a Reddit post posted in February. It was actually brought up in a response to a question that involved whether or not the Mega Knight would receive any changes, saying that they were both in similar positions. In fact, the Mega Knight actually hadn't been changed since 2018, just like the Wizard, except for one consistency change and a bug fix. Also, since Supercell brought it up without being asked while not bringing up other cards like the Witch, who were also in the same position as Wizard after nearly a full year of no changes at that point, the signs pointed towards Supercell experimenting with the Wizard once again. But even though the Mega Knight would go on to receive 2 changes later that year, Wizard would be left out to dry for the 4th year in a row. Despite becoming worse and worse over time, this card actually still remains popular in lower ladder, and its use and win rates in challenges only continued to dwindle until the modern day, where it officially has become the card with the lowest win rate in the entire game. Even with the Executioner getting further attention, Wizard was left out to dry. I know some people will argue that because this card is too game-breaking and frustrating when it's good, it deserves to stay in its current state. But Witch, Mirror, and Elixir Pump were all in this position, and at least Supercell attempted to make these cards viable, even if they weren't successful. When I look at Wizard nowadays, he really just feels kind of outdated. He was great in 2016, but he functions essentially identically to his former self, which just doesn't work in this day and age. To give you some further perspective, 1/4 of the original 42 cards are cheaper today than they were in 2016, and there are so many more efficient options when dealing with Swarm cards. You could argue part of the reason for this decline was just the value of Elixir changing since 2016. With spells always being so popular too, most people were always equipped to deal with Wizard before he even got a single hit. Even if you do think the Wizard shouldn't be competitively viable, why shouldn't it at least be given some sort of small buff to at least give it a chance? Would you argue that the Witch buffs from 2020 and 2021 should have been walked back because they were given when the Witch would have been unhealthy if it was viable? I just don't understand why Supercell refuses to give this card even the slightest bit of attention for so long. Canceling the 2019 rework made sense because the community was already in flames over the Executioner and the Witch. But that's no excuse to neglect it for 3 additional years, especially when you're going to give the 2 cards that people were actually up in flames about attention within that time frame. Some people may just call me a noob for advocating so much on behalf of this card, but in all honesty, I just love to see a good underdog comeback story, and I just want to see some change in the meta. To get this card in a decent position, Supercell would need to have an idea on what they wanted this card to be. So you may ask, if I was in charge of balancing, what would I personally change to the Wizard to fix it? If you've seen my video covering the Witch, you might know what I'm about to say. For the Wizard, I think there are only 2 possible routes. The first one is to buff its health. The stats of the wizard have barely changed since its release, but the health is the one stat of the wizard that has never been changed. 5 elixir cards that die to a fireball zap, also known as fireball-ese, is just not a working formula. If you look back at the one point in history where the witch's health was buffed to have the same health as the modern day archer queen, the stats of this card in grand challenges were actually pretty balanced during this time. However, unfortunately for the witch, they ended up nerfing the health anyway, and thus led the witch to be in a very poor condition once again. The witch and the wizard continue to be in this same situation for a reason. This is why I think the best way to go is to give the wizard a little more health, but make the radius a little smaller. You could even make the wizard deal a lot less damage, but make the hit speed faster to help separate it more from executioner. Obviously, I don't know for sure what the best option is because I haven't tested it, and there are tons and tons of things to consider that I can't possibly consider without some form of testing. Even with testing, Supercell doesn't quite know what is going to work. It's just not possible to know for sure until it's in the game and thousands of players can try it out for themselves. My second solution to fix the wizard, which is the solution I would not advocate for, is to make it 4 elixir and nerf its radius and its hit speed. The reason I would not go this route is because this game has way too many 4 elixir cards already, and I think some diversity in elixir costs should exist, but if they're not going to rework it, at least give it something. One suggestion I will bring up because it's a popular suggestion, although I strongly advocate against this idea, is giving the wizard spawn damage like the other 2 wizards. But although rarities are practically meaningless nowadays, I don't think the route of basically copying other cards' abilities is the way to go. There's certainly many different directions this card can go, so why doesn't Supercell try something? Anything at all. We've never even known what a competitively viable wizard looks like. It seems like they have been testing it a lot in 2019 and 2020 and ultimately decided that the reworks were not working, resulting in them ultimately deciding that wizard was the unhealthiest card in the game when viable. The Mirror may have taken that title at this point, but hey, at least it got a chance in the competitive spotlight. The wizard just seems like a card that never quite grew out of 2016. It's just not fit for the constantly changing climate of Clash Royale and fell far behind. Also, from what I saw, it seems like a large chunk of the community wants this card to remain in a poor state because its prominent place in ladder play, which disincentivizes Supercell even more from giving this card attention. I do believe Supercell will change the wizard one day, but it could just as easily happen next month as it could happen in 5 years. I think it would be cool to see this card being used in competitive play, so I'd really love to see it be given a chance. If it ends up not working out, simply nerf it again, just like the Mirror. Simple as that. Its arguably only time in the competitive spotlight was in January of 2016 before the game was even out of beta, and I don't even know if I would call any gameplay in the first 6 months of the game to be competitive. So just give it a chance in the modern day climate, Supercell. If Witch and Executioner got one, Wizard deserves it just as much. But let me know if you think Supercell should change the Wizard or just leave it alone. Is it better off for the overall health of the game for it to be bad, or should Supercell experiment with a rework? You've heard my thoughts, and I want to hear yours. Also, let me know what other cards you'd like me to cover in the future. My next video will be an in-depth analysis on the Mirror, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss that. Thank you all for watching, and have a wonderful 2023.